Phoebe came running, late again. The glass door slammed with a sharp thud as she pushed it open with her shoulder, trying to balance the cardboard tray holding 2 steaming coffees. The cold Baltimore wind clung to her clothes, the hem of her pants soaked from the drizzle that hadn't stopped since before dawn. She handed one of the cups to the security guard at reception, who looked up with sleepy eyes and smiled. "You save me every day, Phoebe." She just nodded, her face half hidden behind a worn scarf, and climbed the stairs in quick steps as always, no elevator. The still half-asleep building was her refuge, the muffled sound of her own footsteps, the occasional click of a distant key, the hum of the coffee machine at the end of the hallway. It all felt like hers. At her cubicle, the note was there, folded on the keyboard, waiting. Phoebe paused, glanced around without raising her head too much, picked up the paper with cold fingers. Big red letters shouted from the page, "Smells like Buspa's grandma's clothes, higher instant success 2025 LOL." On the back, a crooked doodle, a figure with glasses holding a cat and dropping folders from both hands. A muffled giggle came from somewhere. Phoebe closed her eyes for half a second, then carefully folded the note and slipped it into her top drawer among others just like it. She didn't hesitate. Celeste appeared moments later, as if she'd timed it perfectly. Grey blazer, hair pulled back in a low bun, and sharp eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. "Phoebe, I need you to review the Energy Corp spreadsheets by noon. The ones from last quarter. They're full of errors." Phoebe glanced briefly at her still dark monitor. "That's not in my scope. It is now. The board wants it resolved today." She left before Phoebe could respond. Phoebe sighed. She took off her scarf, adjusted her chair, and turned on the computer. The Energy Corp spreadsheet was a monster. 84 tabs and broken formulas. It wasn't the first time someone had left her the task no one else wanted. Mid-morning, the sound of hurried footsteps and a dragging conversation announced the arrival of the new employee. He appeared between the cubicles holding a crumpled folder, brown hair slightly messy, wearing a suit that looked like it had slept on the floor. "Hi. Does anyone know where finance is?" No one answered. 3 people pretended not to hear. One even put on headphones with deliberate exaggeration. He stopped, embarrassed. Phoebe stood up. "Come on, it's in our section." He smiled, relieved, walked over and stopped beside her cubicle, looking around attentively. "I'm Ross Geller, first day." She nodded. "Phoebe, sit over there. You'll use Marcus's station." "Great, just how does the login work?" Phoebe opened a notepad and began writing down the steps, one by hand. She handed it to him with the pen. "You'll need this pen to press the monitor power button." It stuck. Ross looked at the paper, then the pen, then at her. "Do you always do this? Make things easier for people?" "Only when no one else wants to help." He gave a short, sincere smile. Phoebe noticed his shoes were wet and the left shoelace was untied. Around them, barely hidden whispers started, murmurs with chuckles. "This guy won't last a month. Look at that suit, like it came from the wrong dry cleaner. Who recommended him?" Ross pretended not to hear. Phoebe knew he could. It was impossible not to. Still, he stayed there, quietly adjusting his station like he was trying not to break anything. A bit later, she returned with an old charger. "It's the only one compatible with that company laptop. You can use it until someone asks for it back." He accepted it like an unexpected gift. His expression was hard to read, something between gratitude and a kind of focused attention that was too intense to be casual. "You're different," he said suddenly. She blinked. "Why?" "Because you didn't treat me like a burden." Phoebe looked away. "It's still early. Give me a week." He laughed. It was the first real laugh she'd heard on that floor in months. Time passed. The department carried on as usual. Cold, automated, plastic smiles and endless meetings about goals no one really understood. Phoebe and Ross began sharing small exchanges. She showed him shortcuts in the system. He asked questions about processes most newbies avoided mentioning out loud. At the end of the day, the rain was back. The subway station was 3 blocks away, and Phoebe pulled a half-broken umbrella from her drawer, one of the spokes bent. Ross appeared beside her in the lobby, wet again, ready to face another walk in the drizzle. "Come on," she said, "we can share." They walked side by side through the wet streets. He asked where she was from. Phoebe answered naturally. West Side, near Carroll Park. A neighborhood where buses ignored schedules and the streets were always the last to be cleared after snowstorms. "And you?" "I've lived in a lot of places. None I'd call home." Phoebe didn't ask further. She recognized the tone of someone who didn't want to explain. They reached the station and parted ways there. But before descending the stairs, he turned back. "Phoebe, thanks." She stopped. "For what?" "For reminding me that sometimes the world still has good people." She just shook her head. She wasn't used to kind words, or to someone asking her name. Ross stood there for a few seconds, watching her disappear into the crowd. Then he turned away, shoulders still slightly hunched, like someone carrying more than it seemed. But behind that wrinkled suit and messy hair were eyes that noticed everything with surgical precision. He wasn't new, not in the way people thought. And that company, once a proud family legacy, now reeked of ego, vanity, and rotten silence. Phoebe didn't know, but every gesture, her handwritten note, the shared umbrella, her patience with the spreadsheets, was being recorded. Not on cameras, but in the mind of a man who for years had been trying to understand where he had lost his own humanity. And that rainy morning, between burnt coffee and a cruel joke, he found his first answer. The key turned in the lock with a dry click, and the door gave way with its usual creak. Phoebe stepped inside, kicking off her still damp shoes, leaning her back against the door for a moment, breathing deeply. The house smelled the same as always, a mix of cheap disinfectant, reheated soup, and old newspaper. Familiar, tired. The apartment was small. The living room and kitchen shared the same space. The walls showed signs of age, peeling paint near the outlets, water stains near the window. A thin curtain tried to block the view of the parking lot across the street. In the corner, a noisy portable heater vibrated with effort. She dropped her bag on the worn couch, took off her coat and hung it on the crooked wall hook. Passed through the kitchen, flicked on the yellowish light, and opened the fridge. Pulled out a container with rice and vegetables from 2 days ago. It would have to do. While the microwave spun, Phoebe leaned on the sink and looked at her own hands. Dry, short, bitten nails. She remembered a co-worker once joking aloud that her hands looked like someone who still washes laundry by hand. The joke hung in the air. No one laughed, but no one defended her either. The microwave beeped, cutting through the silence. She carefully removed the container and sat at the small table, legs crossed, body slumped, shoulders heavy. She ate slowly, chewing as if not wanting to hear even her own thoughts. But they came anyway. She thought about Celeste, about the note, the muffled laugh she'd heard near the printer. She also thought about the look in the new guy's eyes, Ross. There was something about him. It wasn't just the clumsy manner, it was like he was more present than he let on, like he was paying too much attention, and yet he didn't seem to know where the bathroom was. Strange. After eating, she washed the container, dried it with the frayed cloth hanging from the stove, and went to the bedroom. The light there was dimmer. The mattress lay directly on the slats, no headboard. Beside it, an old dresser with crooked drawers. On top, an old photo, her 13 with her mother holding a small cake with a sugar crystal topping. Her mother smiled with her eyes, and only with them because her mouth was too tired to open. Phoebe lay on her side, fully dressed. She stared at the ceiling, where a zigzagging crack ran across like a trapped lightning bolt. The truth was, she was tired. Not just from the day, but a tiredness that came from inside, that built up over time like dust in the corner of a cabinet. The constant feeling of being unseen, of not mattering, of doing everything right and still being treated like she was disposable. She sometimes wondered what would happen if she didn't show up to work, if she disappeared for a week. Would anyone notice? Or would they just miss the tidy spreadsheets and correctly named files? Phoebe turned on her side, hugging a limp pillow. Thought about quitting. She'd been thinking about it for months, but there was her mother, who needed medication, lactose-free milk, bills paid on time. And there was rent, and the subway, and the heartwarming coffee from the corner diner. It was an equation with no solution. She closed her eyes, but the thought came back. The way Ross thanked her, the way he asked her name like it mattered. There was something there, a subtle difference. And though she didn't know why, it echoed inside her like a faint spark trying to light something long forgotten. But for now, all she wanted was silence, and to fall asleep before the alarm reminded her that in just a few hours she'd have to start it all over again. The lunchbox was still warm when Phoebe reached the rooftop. She climbed the side stairs carefully, avoiding the cracked steps, and pushed open the rusted iron door that led to the top of the building. Up there, the sound of the street traffic below felt distant, muffled by the height and the constant wind. She liked that space. It was ugly, forgotten. The walls covered in graffiti and a radio antenna taking up half of the east side, but it was hers. No one else ever came up. She spread the folded towel she always carried in her bag and sat down, leaning her back against the wall. She had 30 minutes before the clock forced her back down. She took out the container of rice and lentils, arranged her fork, and began to eat in silence, listening to the hum of the city far below. The sound of shuffling footsteps made her turn. Ross appeared at the top of the stairs, hair tousled by the wind, holding a plastic bag from a cheap diner and looking uncertain. "I thought this was the way to the emergency exit," he said, a little sheepish. "But I saw you and, well, didn't want to interrupt." Phoebe took another bite of lentils and gestured with her head to the spot beside her. "You can sit, but the seat's the floor." He chuckled and sat down a meter away, placing the bag in his lap. "Didn't know there was a place like this up here." "Nobody does. And if they find out, act surprised. Promise." He unwrapped his sandwich from crumpled foil, took a bite, and chewed quietly, eyes on the cloudy sky. "Thanks. For earlier. Helping with the system. And the umbrella." Phoebe shrugged. "I just do what I wish people would do for me." Ross turned toward her, curious. "And do they?" "No. But it doesn't hurt to try to make the world a little less awful, right?" A brief silence followed. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Phoebe had never had many friends at work, not because she was closed off, but because after so many years, she'd learned there was no use opening up to people who had already decided not to listen. Ross wiped his hands with a napkin and stared out at the horizon, where the old city towers drew an uneven outline. "You been here long?" 7 years. Started as an assistant, kept going and got forgotten. "And why are you still here?" She hesitated, then answered, "Because rent doesn't pay itself, and my mom needs help, and leaving without a backup plan would be worse." Ross nodded slowly. "Sometimes it feels like we keep going just because there's no other choice." Phoebe looked at him more closely for the first time. There was something in that sentence, a weight that didn't fit someone who seemed so new here. "Yeah. Sometimes it really does." The watch on her wrist beeped. She stood grabbing the lunch leftovers and folding the towel quickly. "Back before someone thinks I vanished just to avoid work," she said, tossing an awkward smile over her shoulder. Ross stayed a moment longer, watching her disappear down the stairs, the sandwich wrapper still in his lap, the wind messing up his hair again. And for the first time since he'd returned to his father's company, he felt something close to connection. But he didn't have a name for it yet. He just knew it was rare. The HR office smelled of old plastic and burnt coffee. Ross walked in slowly, like he was lost, and found Eddie sitting behind the desk, rearranging forms in colored folders. Eddie was a man in his early 50s, graying hair, a shirt that always had an ink stain on the sleeve, and a gaze that didn't judge, just observed. "Hi. Is this where I go for, like, performance reviews?" Eddie looked up, sizing Ross up. "You the new intern?" "I am. You lost?" "Maybe a little." Eddie chuckled without standing. "Normal. Most new folks show up excited, then fade out little by little. You already in the, what did I get myself into phase?" Ross gave a small smile. "Something like that." "Take a seat. Want some coffee?" "No, thanks. Just wanted to understand how reviews work here. Like, who decides who's doing well, who isn't? How does that process go? Eddie looked at him again, more carefully. That's a question for someone a little too curious. Curious enough to grow. Eddie pulled out a folder and started flipping through it. Here, reviews are done by managers, based on goals, deliverables, and perceptions. Ross didn't answer. He just stood there, absorbing. Beside the printer, a sound broke the moment. A page shot out of the machine and fell to the floor. Eddie didn't notice, but Ross, curious, bent down and picked it up. It was a copy of an email. The sender, Celeste. Subject, silent termination request. Employee, Phoebe Buffane. Ross froze. This, he said, holding out the paper. Is this real? Eddie looked, blinked, swallowed hard. That wasn't supposed to be there. It's a draft. But it's real. Eddie rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable. Sometimes managers request this kind of process. Claim low performance. We just follow protocol. Ross stood slowly. His eyes no longer looked like they had minutes ago. But who checks if it's true, if it's fair? That's not up to me, kid, Eddie said, not unkindly. This system's been running on autopilot for a while. We just try not to hit the walls. Ross left the room without replying. In the hallway, office sounds rushed back in. Keyboards, footsteps, muted laughter. He looked around and saw Phoebe in the break room, standing, arranging the row of mugs on the shelf. One of them had a broken handle. She turned it around, placing it last in the row so no one would grab it by mistake. Ross's chest tightened, not with pity, with anger. How could someone like her be seen as a problem? Something inside him began to shift, something that had been asleep for far too long. And he knew right then that he couldn't pretend anymore. Ross spent the entire afternoon staring at the screen but seeing nothing. The system in front of him showed cost control graphs, but none of it registered. His mind kept spinning. The note Phoebe received that morning. The subtle exclusion, the handoffs of unwanted tasks, and now the silent termination request. Was this what they called a performance culture? He stood and walked to the department's common area, where muffled chatter suggested a small informal meeting. Celeste stood in front of a young intern who seemed to shrink with every word thrown at her. This is a mess. Do you think spreadsheets organize themselves? It takes attention, focus. If I have to check every cell for you, then what's your role here? The intern, her badge said Lena, was red-faced, hands trembling as she held a notepad. I tried, I just didn't know which formula to use. Trying isn't enough. We don't reward effort here, we reward results. And honestly, I don't have time to teach the basics. No one nearby said a word. One group pretended to focus on their screens. Another exchanged subtle glances, but no one stepped in. Ross approached and stood beside the water cooler, watching in silence. Every word from Celeste sounded carefully wrapped in politeness, but the poison was there. Arrogance disguised as professionalism, contempt masked as accountability. When Celeste left, Lena sat down with teary eyes. Ross approached without sitting. The problem wasn't the formula, he said quietly. It was the environment. Lena looked up, surprised. What? You're learning. They've forgotten what that looks like. She didn't answer, but her eyes shone. And in that shine, Ross saw what he'd once seen in himself 2 years earlier, the breaking point. That night, Ross accessed the internal system using an administrative password he hadn't used since he returned. It took 3 tries to remember the pattern he'd created years ago, back when he believed his presence here could make a difference. The screen opened. A sea of reports, performance folders, internal emails, and feedback histories written by managers. He searched for Phoebe Buffane. The system took time to load. When the results appeared, he had to read them twice. Performance category, average. Deliverables volume, above average. Efficiency, high. Collaboration, low perception. Below, a digital note from Celeste. The employee displays an introverted demeanor that hinders team integration, shows limited leadership, questionable potential. Ross clenched his fists. The next report was older. It showed a workflow analysis project for Energy Corp, structured by Phoebe, but archived without credit. The same structure Celeste had presented as her own idea days earlier. There were other documents like it. Ideas, spreadsheets, revisions, all with Phoebe's invisible signature. That night, Ross didn't sleep. He made coffee twice, scribbled on blank pages, reorganized data in a notebook, and began sketching the start of a plan. It wasn't yet a restructuring strategy. It was something more personal. He needed to understand how his absence had allowed the company to become this. When he returned to the office the next morning, everything looked the same. But to him, nothing was the same. Phoebe, as always, was already at her desk, correcting a string of duplicate entries in the finance system. She typed slowly but with precision, humming an old 80s song, voice too low to recognize, but sweet enough for Ross to catch its familiarity. She did it without noticing, humming while working, and for some reason, that made him stop halfway down the corridor. She kept coins in a small jar next to her monitor, always the same number, 3 for the way there, 3 for the way back. That was her subway fare, her routine, her silent math. Ross observed more than he interacted. He needed to truly see. And he began taking notes, not official memos but handwritten observations. He mapped not only workflows but influence paths, who made decisions without speaking, who hid behind meetings, who climbed by stealing others' work, and who, like Phoebe, held up the entire floor without ever being named. One day he saw one of the older employees, Carl, enter the break room in tears. He tried to hide it, but red eyes and a tight throat gave him away. He reached for water, but dropped the cup. Phoebe appeared silently beside him, picked up another cup, filled it, and placed it in his hands. "I heard about your mom," she said simply. No drama. "If you need someone to cover for you today, I've got it." Carl nodded, unable to speak. Phoebe returned to her cubicle, as if it were routine. Ross didn't intervene. But in that moment, he understood. What she didn't fit on a report, or in a spreadsheet. It was the invisible stitching that kept everything standing. At the end of that week, Ross walked into the HR office again. Eddie was there with his folders and tired eyes. "I need to see something," Ross said, more direct this time. Eddie raised an eyebrow. "How long are you going to keep playing this role?" Ross didn't answer right away. "What do you think of Phoebe?" Eddie took his time, leaned back in the chair. "She works harder than 3 people combined, never complains, never makes mistakes, but no one notices, and she never forces anyone to." "Why not?" "Because if she stops to demand recognition, who keeps everything running?" Ross leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His eyes now belonged to someone who was reclaiming who he was, a CEO with eyes trained for numbers, but also for people. "And why hasn't anyone promoted her?" Eddie gave a bitter smile. "Because she doesn't play the game, doesn't suck up, doesn't go to leadership lunches, she doesn't sell an image, she just delivers." Ross slowly shook his head. "Then we're all wrong." And for the first time since he stepped back into that building, he knew what needed to be done. Not just as a CEO, but as a man. The clock read 8:12 when Ross arrived at the office that morning. This time, no crooked tie. His suit was still plain, but something was different about him. His stride more assured, his gaze less lost. Still, he kept up the facade of the awkward intern, offering a brief wave and settling into the station beside Phoebe, who was already typing with focus. She didn't look at him right away. She was deep into fixing a series of duplicate entries from the audit department. Long codes, jumbled numbers, a real mess. "Need help with anything?" he asked, trying not to sound intrusive. "Only if you want to learn how to clean up other people's messes," she replied, not sarcastically but with a touch of weariness in her voice. "Isn't that why we're here?" Phoebe glanced at him. The corner of her mouth lifted, almost a smile. She slid one of the report copies over to him. "Want to see how I separate typos from negligence?" "I do." He took the paper and leaned in a little closer, without invading her space. Phoebe started explaining her thought process, how she identified patterns in the mistakes, errors always made by the same names, same time frames, same departments. None of this was official. It was perception, sharpened instinct from years of practice. Ross wrote everything down by hand, small scribbles in a notebook with no cover. He wasn't just learning the system, he was learning how she thought. During a break, Phoebe pulled a broken pair of earbuds from her drawer, plugged them into the computer, and hit play on an old playlist. From where he sat, Ross could hear bits of the music: Alanis Morissette, Oasis, the Cranberries. Always listen to 90s music? They're the only ones that don't exhaust me. Why's that? Because they weren't screaming for attention. They just sang what they felt. Ross sat quietly for a moment, taking that in. In the days that followed, they fell into a routine without realizing it. Phoebe would bring a piece of chocolate in her bag and place it on his desk every Wednesday. Ross would stop by the diner before work and leave an extra coffee on her desk on Fridays. They never talked about it. It was just understood. She showed him how to navigate the internal bureaucracy, where the hidden files were, how to recover lost data, how to sidestep Celeste's attempts to dump meaningless tasks on others. Ross pretended to know nothing, as any good newbie would. But inside, every action he took was a record. Late one Tuesday, Ross stayed later at the office. Most of the team had already left, and Phoebe was still organizing physical folders in a cabinet near the break room. Bound papers, old client files, outdated manuals. Ross approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "You always stay after hours." "Only when I want things done right, and I know no one else will do it." She said it without bitterness, just matter of fact. "Sounds lonely." "It is, but it gives me peace." Ross studied her for a moment. She wore a turtleneck sweater slightly frayed at the sleeves, her hair tied up haphazardly, her fingers stained with blue ink. "Phoebe, why don't you ever try to be seen?" She paused for a second, not turning to him. "Because trying to be seen here is dangerous. People only notice so they can tear you down. It's safer to stay invisible." "And if someone actually noticed you?" She turned to him slowly. Her eyes weren't fragile. They were steady, tired, but alive. "Then I wouldn't know what to do." Ross nodded. No more questions. He grabbed one of the boxes she was organizing and began stacking it with her, in silence. A simple gesture. No fanfare. But she noticed. 2 days later, Phoebe was sitting in the break room with a cup of tea when a man named Mitchell rushed in. He was from legal, always well-dressed, always in a hurry. "Phoebe, could you help me with the Standard West file? They're asking for a database review and I just don't get that internal form." She looked at him in surprise. Mitchell rarely spoke to her. "You want me to review it?" "I want you to show me how you do it. You understand these things better than anyone here." She didn't respond right away, but motioned for him to sit. Within 10 minutes, she had sketched out a simple flow with post-its and explained the entire process. He thanked her twice before rushing off. Ross, walking down the hallway, saw the whole thing and added another note to the coverless notebook. The next morning, one of the new interns spilled coffee on a keyboard. She panicked. As always, Phoebe appeared, silent, precise. She grabbed paper towels, shut down the equipment, disassembled the keyboard and began drying it from the inside. "This'll still work. Just don't tell Celeste. She thinks interns should learn through suffering." The girl, wide-eyed, whispered, "You should be a leader." Phoebe just laughed, a short, unconvincing laugh. "People have tried to convince me of that before, but in practice, no one listens to someone without a title." One afternoon, Ross passed by the break room and saw something that stayed with him. Carl, the same man who had cried days earlier, was sitting with an envelope in his hand. Phoebe knelt in front of him, gently holding his wrist. "You can breathe here. Just today. Just right now, we'll figure out the rest later." Carl nodded, shaking. The room was empty. Phoebe stayed with him until he was composed. Then she went back to her desk like nothing had happened. Ross knew most managers would pretend they hadn't seen it, that it wouldn't make any report. But he also knew that without it, the place would have already fallen apart. Phoebe was the invisible order of things, and now he saw it clearly. The worn notebook was filling up. Ross scribbled maps, connections, names. The company's structure wasn't outlined in org charts. It was hidden between the lines of emails, in sideways glances in the hallways, in unspoken thank yous. He began to notice how small decisions were made by people without titles, but with real influence, and especially how the people keeping the operation running, like Phoebe, were systematically erased from that power chain. On one page, he drew 3 circles. In the center, her name. Around it, the departments where she had corrected mistakes that weren't hers. Finance, contracts, tech support. Under each, a note. Reviewed budget spreadsheet. Reconfigured performance reports. Adjusted PTO controls. All without credit. Meanwhile, she carried on. At the start of the week, Ross arrived earlier than usual. When Phoebe got there, he was already at his desk. A coffee was waiting for her, the kind she always bought from the diner down the block. Thought maybe today you'd like one ready and waiting. She looked at the cup, then at him. You remembered my order. Hard not to, always the same. Black, no sugar, no fuss. She smiled, slightly, but it was genuine. Ross stepped closer. Can I ask you something? You can. Why have you never left this department? Haven't you been offered roles elsewhere? Phoebe sighed, stirring her coffee with the plastic straw. Twice. But one was for a front-facing role someone quit because they couldn't stand the boss. The other was to do the same thing, just with a fancier title and more pressure. Didn't see the point in swapping door signs. But what if it was something different? She looked at him. Different how? He hesitated. He wanted to say, a role built from scratch to recognize what you do. But that wasn't possible, not yet. Truly different, with purpose. She shrugged. Purpose doesn't pay the bills, especially when no one believes it belongs to you. Ross swallowed hard, because she was right, and it stung. Later that day, the department had to review a string of contracts for a mid-size client. The internal system froze. 2 analysts got confused over document versions. Once again, Phoebe was the one who caught the mistake, a miswritten clause that could result in a fine. This part's wrong, she said, pointing. One of the analysts, visibly annoyed, replied, but that clause was approved by management. It's still wrong, the number of zeros is off. That changes the entire margin calculation. He scowled. Fine, I'll fix it. Phoebe returned to her desk, didn't push, didn't call it out, just adjusted her glasses and kept going. Ross watched from a distance and wrote, always. That night, he pulled everything together, created a complete flowchart of incidents where Phoebe had prevented crises. Then he pulled up her HR records and cross-referenced them with her evaluations. The contrast was appalling. One of the reviews read, does not take initiative, low leadership projection. And yet, there she was, leading in silence every day. Ross knew seeing it wasn't enough. He had to act. But the right moment hadn't come yet. He needed to observe a little longer, confirm what he already suspected. That week, something new happened. Phoebe dropped a notebook on her way out of the break room. Ross bent down to help her pick it up. As he handed it back, he saw a yellowed page between the covers, a letter, folded, with a coffee stain on the corner. She noticed his look. It's from my mum, she said before he could ask. She wrote it when I got fired from my first job, said sometimes the world tries to silence people who speak quietly. But I didn't need to yell. Just keep going. She still says stuff like that? Phoebe smiled at the corner of her mouth. Now she forgets where she put the keys, but she still knows I like chamomile tea at night. A brief silence. You take care of her? Always. Since I was 18, Alzheimer's started slow. Now, she remembers some things and makes up others. Sometimes she calls me Clarice. That was her grandmother's name. And you answer? If it makes her smile, I'll be whoever she wants. Ross didn't reply, just watched. In his mind, plans were taking shape. But in his heart, something stronger was growing. Respect, admiration, humanity. 2 days later, on a grey Friday, Ross showed up at reception and greeted the security guard Phoebe always shared coffee with. The man, named Henry, smiled. Early today, huh? Wanted to try the coffee before Phoebe. They say hers is the best. Henry let out a quick laugh. That girl carries this company on her back, and no one sees it. Ross looked at his watch. I see it. He took the stairs like she always did. When he reached the department, she was already there. sorting through emails, fixing schedules, adjusting deadlines missed by co-workers who'd gone on vacation and left things unfinished. At the heart of it all, without fanfare, there she was, the invisible order of things. That Monday, the executive board meeting was scheduled with less than 24 hours' notice. The email was blunt, leaving no room for questions. Strategic presentation, new directions for the finance department. Attendance mandatory for all coordinators and managers. Phoebe read the notice without much thought. She was never invited to that kind of meeting. She wasn't a coordinator. Officially, she was a technical control analyst too, a generic title that concealed the weight of what she actually did. Celeste, on the other hand, was excited. She wore a fitted black dress, high heels, a new blazer. She paced back and forth with a tablet in hand, rehearsing lines, tweaking slides, swapping out words. Her commands were quick, clipped. "Marcus, you're going to leave the first part of the spreadsheet open on the system, just so I can pretend I'm pulling the data in real time," she said without even looking at him. Ross, sitting at his desk, observed with quiet focus. His worn notebook was open, another page filled with scribbles. Phoebe's project presentation, now Celeste's. He didn't need confirmation anymore. He'd already compared the files. The spreadsheets were identical. The fiscal impact analysis, the proposal to reallocate funds, even the layout of the graphs. The only difference was the name in the footer. Now it read Celeste M. Watson. Phoebe, in the back of the room, was catching up on a backlog of emails. She had no idea her work was about to be showcased as someone else's brainchild. Ross watched her for a long moment. She still wore that same faded grey coat for cold days, carried the same quiet posture, and kept the same sharp eye for the details no one else cared to notice. The boardroom was spacious, with frosted glass walls and black leather chairs. A large screen projected graphs with elegant precision, and every word from Celeste sounded rehearsed, like lines in a corporate stage play. "And with this restructuring, we've reduced costs, improved operational efficiency, and created a sustainable long-term model, all based on internal data, of course, developed by my strategic analysis team." Ross sat in the back. He didn't say a word, just watched. Phoebe wasn't in the room. She was watching from the adjacent office with the rest of the uninvited employees. The internal broadcast had no audio, just the visuals and the slides, ticking one by one. But Phoebe recognized everything. Every graph, every number, every layout. It was the report she had compiled months earlier on her own, an informal exercise to rethink the department's organization. A file saved in a shared folder, one that didn't bear her name but whose structure was entirely hers. Built during lunch breaks and late nights at home while caring for her mother. She glanced at her colleagues around her. No one seemed to notice the theft, or if they did, they pretended not to. One or two even nodded in approval. The same approval she had never received. Phoebe lowered her gaze. After the presentation, Ross stood up. He headed straight to HR, where Eddie was sorting through forms. "We need to talk," he said firmly. Eddie looked at him, sensing the shift in Ross's tone. "About what?" "Projects, stolen ideas, erased employees." "Ross, you shouldn't. I want to know, how many reports, presentations, and improvement proposals have been repurposed by other managers?" Eddie hesitated. "It happens. I can't give you numbers, but it's more common than you think." "And why does no one do anything?" "Because it's subtle. Files change hands without a trace, because the people who speak up lose space, and the ones who actually keep things running don't have time to defend themselves." Ross placed his hands on Eddie's desk. "What if I want to change that?" "Then you'll have to shake more than the structure. You'll have to challenge the names that matter." Ross didn't reply. He left the room. That afternoon, Phoebe was finalizing a quarterly report. Her eyes looked sunken. Her hands were steady but slower. Her voice silent. Ross approached. "I saw your spreadsheet today." She didn't answer. The restructuring one. Celeste presented it like it was hers. Phoebe only nodded, eyes still on the screen. "You're not going to say anything?" She took a deep breath. "Say what?" "That a weird intern saw it." That I wrote an unsolicited report and left it unsigned because I thought no one would ever read it? But it was yours. And what difference does that make? Ross stood beside her. He didn't push, but his eyes said more than any reply could. Then he walked away slowly, and in the stillness of the screen Phoebe felt something burn. It wasn't anger. It was a pain she knew all too well, the pain of being essential, but never acknowledged. That night, Ross returned to the notebook. He opened a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, "First real decision. HR can't just be administrative. It has to be moral." And below, base restructuring project authorship tracking ethical weight in evaluations. A voice for those who hold things up. He looked at the ceiling, then at the window, and he knew this company could still become something, but not with the same people in charge. And it would all start with the courage to name things. The next morning, the news traveled quietly. Ross Geller had requested a private meeting with HR leadership. That alone wasn't unusual. Interns were always getting lost in the system, booking the wrong meetings, asking awkward questions. But Eddie knew. And when he saw Ross standing at the door, the same tired face now lit with new determination, he sensed this visit was different. "Close the door," Ross said, direct. Eddie did. Sat down. Watched the man in front of him, the same one who fumbled with logins, who asked how to save spreadsheets, who wore his shirt untucked. Now with rolled sleeves, notebook in hand, and the look of someone who wasn't asking permission. Just informing. "I want to initiate a formal reform of the HR structure," Ross said, starting with an audit of responsibilities and internal recognition. Eddie raised his eyebrows. "You know how big that is, right?" "I know exactly. And you know you don't have the authority to initiate something like that." Ross placed the notebook on the desk, opened to the page with the system's internal signature, showed the code. "CEO, active since February 4th, he said steady. "And that access isn't borrowed, it's mine, because I'm who you think didn't come back." It took Eddie a few seconds to react. He stared at the name, then at Ross, then back at the name. "You're Ross Geller, the founder's son, and current CEO." "Yes, but why?" Ross didn't look away. "Because I wanted to see with my own eyes what was left of the company my father built. I needed to know if there was still something here worth saving, and now I know. There is." Eddie rubbed his face. "So all of this was necessary. I needed to feel what others feel, to be ignored, underestimated, treated like a problem just because I didn't perform in 3 days the way they expected. You're going to stir things up." "I'm going to do what's right." Eddie exhaled deeply. "What do you need from me?" "I want to know who the invisible names are, the ones holding up the system without getting any credit. I want every case of recycled projects, hijacked recognition, manipulated feedback. And I want you with me on this, because I know you haven't agreed with any of it for a long time." Eddie looked at him closely, for the first time, without walls. "All right, I'll get it for you. But when the walls start shaking, don't back down." "I won't." Ross stood up, left the notebook with Eddie. "Start with Phoebe Buffane. She's the beginning." In the main office area, Phoebe was reviewing a tax spreadsheet. Slight dark circles under her eyes, her coat tossed over the chair, her hands typing with precision as always. Celeste walked in, laughing with another manager. They were talking about a possible company trip to a seminar in Miami. "Only the top performers are going," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No room for dead weight." Phoebe didn't react, didn't look up, just kept typing. But Ross heard, and in that moment, he decided there would be no retreat, no filter. 2 days later, a new internal summons hit the leaders' inboxes. Structural review and operational ethics, closed meeting with executive leadership. Celeste was the first to reply with a thumbs-up emoji in the coordinators group. She assumed it would be another opportunity to validate her status. On the afternoon of the meeting, Ross entered the room before anyone else. He no longer played a role. He wore a dark suit, a straight tie, hair neatly tied back, posture steady. He wasn't the awkward intern anymore. He was the man who led by what he saw, not what he was told. When the coordinators arrived, Celeste in the lead, the room fell silent. Eddie came in last, holding a thick folder of documents. Ross didn't use slides, didn't open graphs, he just spoke. What keeps a company standing isn't targets, it's people, and the ones who deliver the most are usually the ones who ask for the least credit. Silence. These past few months I've observed, taken notes, learned. And now I share a simple fact. Over 40% of key contributions from last quarter came from people not mentioned in a single report. Celeste cleared her throat, uncomfortable. Ross, I'm sorry, but what contributions are you referring to? He looked at her. Your last presentation, the one built on data you didn't create, graphs structured by an employee who wasn't even invited to watch her own work be used as a showcase. Celeste froze. Are you accusing me of... I'm just stating facts. The reports are here. He gestured to Eddie, who opened the folder. The atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy. Ross continued. Today marks a new phase. The HR department will be restructured. All recognition and attribution processes will be audited, and new leadership will be identified based on what they actually deliver, not on appearances. Celeste stood up. This is a personal attack. No, this is a moral realignment, and if you feel attacked, maybe you've been in the wrong place for too long. She didn't respond, sat down again. Pale. Ross closed. A company is like a bridge. It's not built with speeches, but with beams. And now we're going to reinforce those beams, with real names, starting today. Phoebe watched the meeting through the office window, again without sound. But this time, there was something in Ross's eyes, in the firmness of his stance, that made everything feel different. And for the first time, she didn't know where to hide. Phoebe opened the filing drawer to store a printed report when a loose, yellowed sheet, folded in thirds, slipped to the floor. She bent down, picked it up carefully, and read the heading. Restructuring Plan, Executive Board. It was an official document. The page was stamped with the internal presidential seal, and in the top right corner, the name, Ross Geller, CEO, active since February. The blood seemed to drain from her legs. The paper trembled in her hand, even as her fingers tried to steady it. She turned the sheet over. She recognized every suggestion she had once shared informally, every part of the organizational chart that she had sketched months ago in a spreadsheet to improve communication between departments. Now, there it was, as part of a formal reform proposal signed by him. Him, the intern, the odd one, the clumsy one, Ross Geller. The name was right there, cold, definitive, like a password revealed too late. Phoebe walked slowly back to her desk, barely aware of her steps. Her eyes returned to the page. His name echoed in her mind along with every memory from the past few days. The shared coffee, the handwritten notes, the patient listening. The words she thought came from an equal. They hadn't. They never had. She grabbed her bag, left the page on her desk unfolded, passed through the break room without speaking to anyone, walked out the glass door as if the floor were made of cotton. Eddie saw her leave, called her name once. She didn't answer. He didn't insist. That night, Ross noticed her absence when he returned from a meeting with the transition committee. Phoebe's cubicle was empty, but not like it was during lunch breaks. It was different. Cold. Her tea mug was gone, no post-its. The little towel on her chair, gone. He looked around and stepped closer. On her keyboard lay the page she had found, open, deliberately left behind. Ross picked it up and stared at his own name in the top corner. A tightness pressed in his chest, but he didn't let it take over. He grabbed his phone, thought about calling, didn't. He opened his notes app, wrote a short message. You taught me more than any university ever could. He hit send, then turned off the phone. The next day, Phoebe's absence disrupted everything. The department looked like it was functioning, but nothing moved in sync. A report went out with swapped figures. A client followed up about a duplicate invoice. Tasks had been assigned, but no one could find the correct files. It was as if an invisible thread had been pulled, and now the entire fabric was starting to unravel. Celeste, who had been ordered to reassume operational tasks after the announced restructuring, threw out one of her usual barbed remarks. Funny how much we're missing one random analyst. Someone should have written down where she hid her magic files. Ross heard, and didn't let it slide. He stood up, walked silently across the department, and stopped in front of Celeste's desk. "What did you say?" She swallowed hard. "I just said, you stole a report, erased the author's name, and now you're questioning her absence. Don't mock the value of the person who kept this place standing while you climbed by taking credit for other people's work." The silence in the department was instant. No one typed. No one even breathed too loudly. Celeste tried to recover. "Are you trying to humiliate me?" "No, you did that yourself. I'm just holding up the mirror." She looked away. Ross walked back to his desk. 2 days. That's how long Phoebe stayed out of sight. At her small apartment, she took care of her mother, who asked the same questions every 30 minutes. "Is it Wednesday today, Ja? Did you go to school? Where's your dad?" Phoebe answered with patience, even though her chest was tight. She knew her mother's mind was a puzzle with missing pieces. She brewed tea, managed medications, cleaned the sink, sat next to her for repeated stories, and avoided looking at her phone at all costs, until Eddie showed up in the late afternoon. She heard the knock on the door and recognized him immediately when she opened it. "Sorry to show up like this, but I have something for you." He held out a sealed manila envelope. "It's not a termination letter," he said, before she could ask. "It's an invitation." Phoebe took it hesitantly, opened it. Inside was a project draft. Title: Internal Program for Emotional Wellness and Operational Recognition. At the bottom margin, 2 signatures. Ross's and hers, digitized from the old files where she always signed her name in small letters in the footers. At the end of the page, a thick paper card. On it, handwritten, "You weren't invisible. I just didn't know where to look." Phoebe closed her eyes for a moment, and for the first time in many months, she cried quietly. Not out of sadness, but from a rare kind of recognition, the kind that doesn't come with applause or pats on the back. It comes with the weight of knowing that someone saw, and in seeing chose to change. She wiped her eyes, folded the paper carefully, and said in a low voice, "I still don't know if I can come back." Eddie nodded. "That's okay. But now, at least, the place isn't the same anymore." Phoebe looked over at her mother, who was sleeping in the recliner with the radio playing softly, then at the window, where the city darkened slowly. She held the envelope against her chest, and she knew something inside her had already returned, even if her steps weren't quite ready to follow. The room was dark, but Phoebe was still awake. Her mother snored softly in the living room, and the old radio played a classical music station laced with static. Streetlights cast reflections on the wall. She had been holding the envelope for over an hour, as if it weighed more than just paper. She thought of Ross's face, not the clumsy intern's face, but the man who had stood up to Celeste in front of everyone, who didn't look away, who wrote in his own handwriting, "I just didn't know where to look." She hadn't replied to the message, hadn't opened her emails, hadn't touched her phone except to check the time, but she knew he was waiting, and she also knew that what they had built, however small, wasn't imaginary. It was real. Phoebe got up, walked slowly across the apartment, grabbed the kettle and made tea. She sat beside her mother, who slept beneath a crocheted blanket. Stayed there, just watching. She almost resigned that morning. Typed the draft, saved it as an unsent email, but something kept her from clicking send. It wasn't about attachment to the company. It was about not wanting to give up on herself, not now, not when someone had finally seen her. On the 3rd morning, Eddie showed up again. This time not with an envelope, but with eyes full of intent. "He didn't ask me to come, but I thought you should know." Phoebe didn't speak. She waited. "Today he's announcing the transition officially, the departure of the old HR leadership, the creation of a new structure, and the new project, the one you started." She looked at him, exhausted. "I'm not ready." "No one is. But sometimes it's not about being ready. It's about being there when things finally start to change. Phoebe closed the door without answering. In the main floor conference room, the mood was tense. Ross stood at the head of a long table, facing about 15 people, board members, managers, critical department leads. They were all expecting something polished, something technical, but that's not what they got. For years, this company ran on a false idea of meritocracy. The louder you spoke, the higher you climbed. The quiet ones became disposable support. That ends today. Silence. We're not just swapping pieces. We're rebuilding the foundation. People like Celeste Watson are no longer part of the new vision. The HR department has been dissolved. A new division will be created. Department of Operational Humanization. A ripple moved through the room. Someone whispered, "Humanization?" Another muttered, "Is that actually going to work?" Ross raised his voice, but didn't need to shout. It will, because it already is. Because even without a leadership badge, there were people holding this company up, while the so-called leaders sold appearances. Outside, at the far end of the corridor, Phoebe watched everything. No one noticed her. She didn't want to be noticed. She stood at the edge, just like always. But for the first time, something in her was being heard, even without her speaking. Her name didn't appear on the screen. Ross didn't say it. He didn't announce, "Phoebe Buffane created this project." He didn't read a tribute, didn't give a dramatic speech, didn't use a single cliché. He just said one sentence, looking straight at the board. Sometimes a quiet gesture shifts the foundation of an entire building. You only realize it when the shaking stops. When the meeting ended, chairs began to empty. Ross remained in the room, alone, his jacket unbuttoned, hands in his pockets. He looked out at the city, thought of his father, thought of the days he wanted to walk away from it all again. And then he heard slow footsteps approaching. She stopped at the door, said nothing. He didn't either. They looked at each other for a few seconds. Then Phoebe spoke. "I still don't know if I can trust." Ross took 2 steps toward her, steady but without arrogance. "I don't want you to trust. I want you to see." He handed her a thin folder. Inside were the documents Phoebe had compiled over the past few months, printed, catalogued, with her signature now official, and on top a new cover page, the project renamed, listing her as a formal co-author. Phoebe read in silence. When she looked at him, her eyes were glassy, but steady. "Why now?" "Because I finally saw what I should have seen from the beginning, and because you showed me what matters when I had stopped believing in anything." She didn't answer. He pulled a second envelope from his pocket, smaller, handed it to her. Phoebe opened it right there. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. As she unfolded it, she froze. It was a list, handwritten, names, Phobia, Poby, Phoebe, Fina, Pobby, Foopy. All the wrong names she had been called over the years, with sarcasm, mockery, indifference, all of them. On the back, just one sentence. "The world's going to learn the right one now." Phoebe folded the paper gently, like someone holding a story, like someone holding their own name finally recognized. She looked at Ross, still silent. He just stood there, steady, present. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was respect. The room was full. It was the third-floor auditorium, rarely used, with rows of plastic chairs lined up in straight formation and a small elevated platform at the back. This was where orientation trainings were held, internal courses, company-wide meetings that no one ever took too seriously. This time was different. Employees were summoned with a direct message through the system, official communication from the presidency, mandatory attendance. No further details. At the scheduled time, Ross walked in with steady steps, no tie, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, eyes focused, like someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Around 60 people filled the auditorium. Most watched with curiosity. Some still saw him as the awkward intern from a few weeks ago, others already knew. He stopped at the center of the platform, no microphone. He spoke with a clear, firm voice. "I'm Ross Geller, son of this company's founder, current CEO." A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Someone's eyes widened. Another whispered, "Knew he was too weird to be just an intern." But no one stood up. No one interrupted. Ross continued, "For a long time, I tried to save this company from the outside. With advice, reports, formal meetings, it didn't work. Because what was broken wasn't the business model. It was what happened between the lines, what doesn't show up on the slides. And the only way to understand that was to become invisible." He paused for a second, looked at every face, one by one. "What I saw made me want to walk away again, but I found people here who are still holding everything up. And they do it without expecting recognition, because they believe it's the right thing to do. Those people are going to be seen now." A heavy silence filled the room. Ross turned toward a nearby screen. A slide was projected with the title, "New Ethical Leadership Structure and Operational Humanization." Below it, a redrawn org chart. Human Resources Department dissolved. In its place, a new unit, flatter, leaner. Effective today, the current Human Resources leadership has been officially dismissed. Celeste Watson is no longer part of this organization. Eyes darted around the room, some surprised, others dead silent. Celeste, seated in the middle row, held her posture, but her jaw was clenched tight. "We're starting a new cycle, one where leaders are defined by what they build, not by how loudly they speak." He paused again. "And I'm not going to name names here, because the right names are already in motion. You'll recognize them by what you've seen over the past few days, and by what you'll see in the months to come." Phoebe, seated at the back of the room, listened unnoticed. She was there because Eddie insisted. She had wanted to decline, but he told her, "You won't have to say anything, just being there is enough." And she agreed. When she heard Celeste's name being dismissed, she didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply breathed, like someone finally releasing a weight carried for years. After Ross's speech, employees slowly filtered out. Some left in silence, others in hushed groups, many still processing what they'd just heard. Phoebe stayed. She remained seated, her bag in her lap, eyes fixed on the screen that now showed only the company logo. She didn't move until nearly everyone else had gone. Minutes later, in the main hallway, Ross was waiting. She walked with short steps, gauging the distance. He didn't smile, didn't try to ease the moment. He simply held out an envelope. It wasn't a document, it wasn't a promise, it was a concrete proposal. "You asked me once if anything different existed. This is." Phoebe took the envelope, opened it right there. It was an internal designation letter. Coordinator Operational Humanization Unit, Phoebe Buffane. The role came with a detailed scope: active listening, internal support, review of employee recognition processes, mapping silent talent. Everything she had already been doing, now acknowledged. Formal, official. She read carefully, then looked at him. "Are you giving me this because you feel guilty?" Ross shook his head. "No, I'm giving it to you because you're the only person who can actually do this, and because I know that even if I didn't give it, you'd still keep doing it, like you always have." She hesitated, thought about saying no, about saying it was too late, that she didn't want titles, but deep down she knew it wasn't about the name on the door, it was about what that name meant now. "And what if I accept, and nothing changes? Then hold me accountable, publicly if you want, but help me stay on course with what I've learned." Phoebe took a deep breath, placed the envelope in her bag, still didn't say yes or no. But she didn't walk away. And for Ross, that was already an answer. Phoebe pushed the glass door open with her shoulder, just as she did every morning. But this time the eyes that once passed over her like she was part of the furniture lingered for a second longer. No one said anything. No greetings, no overt reactions. But something in the air had shifted, as if the entire space was trying to understand what it meant, now that the woman, always silent, always in the background, was returning with the same worn bag and the same steady steps. She crossed the lobby without looking to either side, gave Henry the security guard a slight nod. He returned it with a discreet smile and a small hand gesture, like someone greeting someone important, but without the fanfare. She took the stairs, entered the finance floor like someone who knew every sound, every rustling sheet of paper, every held breath. And she did know. The difference was now, everything seemed to bend slightly around her presence, like a room holding its breath to listen better. Phoebe didn't give a speech, didn't stop to explain. She simply walked to her old desk, set her coffee down, took off her scarf, and pulled out her chair. Turned on the computer, waited for the screen to light up, and started typing. The sound of the keys was the same as always. So was the focus in her eyes. But next to her monitor, there was now a new metal nameplate, subtle, elegant. Coordinator of Operational Humanization, Phoebe Buffane. The plate had been installed the night before. No ceremony, no internal memo. Just placed there with precision in the exact spot where she had been invisible for so long. Phoebe felt the weight of a few glances from co-workers. People who had barely acknowledged her before now glanced over with poorly concealed curiosity. She didn't look back, not out of pride, but because she still didn't know how to react to being seen. She had learned invisibility as a form of protection. Being noticed was a new exercise. A few minutes later, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed on the carpeted hallway. It was different from all the others. Ross appeared, blazer unbuttoned, shirt sleeves rolled, holding 2 cups of coffee. Beside him was Henry, carrying a third. They stopped in front of her desk. Ross placed one of the coffees on the edge of her desk. No words, just the gesture. The same kind of cup she used to bring him every morning, weeks ago. Phoebe looked at the cup, then looked at Henry, who silently extended his as well. "We figured today was a good day to start again," Ross said calmly. She nodded, took the cup, and brought it to her lips. "It's stronger than the kind I make." "Still learning," he replied with a slight smile. Henry chuckled, gave Ross a light pat on the shoulder, and stepped away. Ross remained for a few more seconds. "No one prepared a speech," he said. "No slides. It's just happening." Phoebe took a sip of the coffee, then turned back to the screen. "Better that way." He started to leave, but before taking the first step, something on her desk caught his eye. It was a folded piece of paper, a note. Phoebe noticed. She picked it up carefully and unfolded it. It was simple, a small white card with tiny hand-drawn letters. "Now everyone sees you, but I saw you first." She didn't respond with words, but her fingers closed over the paper gently, like someone recognizing a small treasure, too valuable to be put on display. Ross took 2 steps back and extended his hand, not as a greeting, but as an invitation. Phoebe hesitated for a second, then extended hers too, shook his hand firmly, without hurry, without doubt. When they let go, he simply nodded, turned and walked away, steady. She turned back to the screen. Her fingers resumed their rhythm across the keyboard. The department continued its usual pace. But something had changed. It wasn't just the title on the nameplate. It wasn't just the silence that now respected her presence. It was her. She was there, whole. And for the first time, they knew her name. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what it meant to you. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is really important for the channel. Really important. And if you're ready for another story of love and hope, click the first card or the second one to watch the full playlist. See you there.